Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please welcome to the stage Karen Salzer, CEO of Bloomberg Media.
Good morning. Wow, that video, a shared responsibility to protect our world. Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Bloomberg Green Festival, the first ever presented by Amazon. Woo! The Bloomberg team has been working on this festival for many, many months, and seeing it come to life yesterday, for me, for the team, and hopefully for many of you, was truly a unique and exciting experience. And there is so much more to come today and in the next few days. Our hosts, Meg Szabo and John Fraher, will join us in a moment to share more about today's programming. But first, a thank you to all of you, to the innovators, to the activists, to the investors in business, in government, in technology, who are committed to climate solutions. Bloomberg's role is to deliver data-driven news and connections for leaders to inform and to enhance opportunities for progress. But this festival could not happen without all of you, the leaders, showing up with your ideas and also your actions. So, thank you for that. I left last night's programming feeling inspired and more hopeful, and being more optimistic is one of my climate pledges. Mike Bloomberg said, growing the economy and fighting the climate crisis go hand in hand. And Adrian Grenier, thank you for Mike, Adrian Grenier wrapped up last night's conversations encouraging all of us to expand our handprint by doing good in the world. And those Bloomberg ones to watch, they are doing that every single day already. And now it's our turn. So over these next few days, we have the opportunity to improve the future of our planet. So let's get to work. Thank you to Mayor Harrell and the City of Seattle for providing this beautiful backdrop for such important work. And now I'd love to turn it over to Meg and to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So welcome back to the Bloomberg Green Festival. We have a full day ahead with content across five spaces in the festival campus. We've got interviews, performances, comedy, breakouts, town halls, workshops, and even counseling if you need it.
But before we dive in, just a few quick announcements. First, I would like to thank our title sponsor, Amazon. Our festival's official airline, Alaska Airlines. Our supporting sponsor, Providence. And our contributing sponsor, Weyerhaeuser.
And if you need to connect to Wi-Fi, we have it here on our screens above my head. And it's also posted, that QR code is posted around the event and on your app.
Speaking of the app, you can download the app on the QR code on the back of your badge. There you can you can speak to other fellow attendees in the community. You can build your own schedule for the day and a lot more. So please download that app.
And on the front of your badge, for those of you who in attendance today, there is a free. If you click on the app or download the app, you will get a free 3-month subscription to Bloomberg.com. And you can also find us on the major social media platforms, post pictures, engage in the conversation on social using the hashtag BBG Green Festival.
All right, now let's get started. We begin with a conversation on the power of electricity. Please join me in welcoming to the stage voting rights activist and author Stacey Abrams and founder and CEO of Rewiring America, Ari Matusiak, for a live recording of the podcast Zero with our Bloomberg's Akshat Ratti.
Welcome to Zero and welcome to the Bloomberg Green Festival. Now, Ari, let's start with a simple proposition. When we think about climate solutions, one way to think about them is that we need to electrify more and more of our lives. And we need to produce that electricity as carbon-free as possible, ideally fully carbon-free very soon. It's not going to solve all our problems, but it gets us damn close. So could you talk us through what Rewiring America's biggest successes have been? Because you are trying to get electrification to people.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me and for hosting this conversation. I think the thing that is really not known to people about the damn close part is that 42% of our energy-related emissions come from basically 5 decisions that we make at our kitchen tables, maybe 6. kind of cars you drive, how you heat the air and water in your homes, how you cook your food, dry your clothes, maybe whether you get solar on your rooftop. That's 42% of our energy-related emissions. Those kitchen table decisions are really, for the most of us, the largest climate impact we will have in our lives, or have the opportunity to have. And so there is this really incredible opportunity to shift the locus of agency and power to the kitchen table. And what we've been trying to do at Rewiring America is tell that story and then empower households in those kitchen table decisions through a combination of policy incentives and tools that they can use to actually make those decisions the easy ones to go forward with and get the benefits of in the process.
And so far, what have been your biggest successes?
Well, it's not our success alone, certainly, but the Inflation Reduction Act was something that we were really involved with in shaping, because what we recognized was that the upfront costs of these better electric machines are too expensive still for too many households. And so the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of these kitchen table incentives for people that could be as much as $500 billion going to households over the next decade. And we were very involved in shaping that.
Right. And Stacey, now working on energy and environment issues is not something that's new to you. It goes as far as back as your senior thesis in college, I understand. And of course, it's featured in your work in public office and your campaigns. Now, you've been with Rewiring America for over a year. What are the biggest barriers that you still see are remaining in trying to get people to recognize that electrifying their lives is beneficial to them, even before it is beneficial to the planet?
I think the challenge is not convincing people it's beneficial, it's convincing people it's accessible. Because for the low-income, moderate-income families that are facing this challenge, they hear the specter of climate action, but they often see the behavior of people who are wealthier, who can afford to make choices. And so often it feels like sacrifice. It doesn't feel like progress. And I think the important piece of the work Rewiring has done, the incredible investment that comes from the Inflation Reduction Act, is that it shifts the conversation from one of, can I afford it, to how do I get it? When people get to make decisions that benefit their lives, they are much more likely to do so. We like getting stuff. And people like being cooler in the summer, they like being warmer in the winter, they like their power bills going down. And what we have to do is actually create the space for them to understand that's doable for the first time. You mentioned that I have been working on these issues for a very long time. Most people aren't aware that that's part of my portfolio. But I grew up in southern Mississippi. I grew up near Cancer Alley in Louisiana. I grew up in petrochemical corridors where communities were often not served and where it seemed impossible for progress to happen. I lived in a community in college where the juxtaposition of where I went to school and where my older sister went to school was very distinct. And so a large part of this is just letting people know what's available, what's possible, and that they can afford it. Because this is a moment, to Ari's point about it being a kitchen table issue, every kitchen table can solve this problem because there's money to help you. And so part of the work of Rewiring, in fact, the core of Rewiring, is helping people understand all of the money that's available, all of the tools that are available, and then shifting their belief system to know that they get to benefit. They just have to believe it's possible.
Right. And Ari, you talked about the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a big bill. It does many things. How specifically have you been able to use what the IRA has put out for the work that you've done with Rewiring America? Yeah,
well, one of the first things that we did was we built a calculator for households to access to understand what they were eligible for in the Inflation Reduction Act itself. We've had almost 1 million households access that over the past 2 years while these benefits are coming online. And we haven't spent $1 advertising for that. And because, to Stacey's point, people like getting stuff, but they don't know how to navigate. And so the first thing that we have done is really start investing in these tools to help make that kitchen table conversation personal and accessible, to Stacey's point, for every household in the country. That's really important because most people don't think about this stuff on a day in and day out basis. I work with a lot of people who are climate geeks. I still haven't met someone who says, I can't wait for the new model of the water heater to come out because I'm totally upgrading next year. That's not a conversation people have.
Yeah.
At least not most people. And so we've been really focused on creating the sort of the access points and the on-ramps for households. And then the other thing that we did, and that Stacey and I have been working on over the last year and change, is that we put together a coalition to apply for something called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And we were selected for $2 billion to really create a way forward for low and moderate income households in communities so that every kitchen table is able to participate and afford these improvements.
Now, the Inflation Reduction Act came up very first answer, and it's crucial because none of this happens without policy. And policy doesn't happen without politics. Now, on so many issues, including on climate, there is a clear choice at the 2024 election. And Stacey, you said it, the choice is not Donald Trump. But that means we must face the inescapable question, which is, then who? And you wrote an op-ed yesterday saying that it must be, the Democratic nominee for president must be Joe Biden.
Yes.
Why is that?
He is our president, he is our nominee, and he will be president again if we do the work necessary to make it so. But let's be clear, we would not have the Inflation Reduction Act, we would not have the billions of dollars that are being poured into communities of color, into low-income communities, into rural communities, into Native American communities, but for President Joe Biden. We know that, we know absolutely that these dollars will be transformative. In Georgia, one of the ways rewiring has been incredibly prescient in thinking about this. We are doing demonstration projects around the country in Milwaukee, in Gresham, Oregon, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in East Point, Georgia, and in DeSoto, Georgia. There's a lot of Georgia. I get to be a part of it, so there's a lot of Georgia. But in DeSoto, Georgia, we're actually making certain that every household that wants something is getting the investment of an upgraded appliance. We have a woman who was living without running water in her home because she couldn't afford to upgrade her water heater. It had rusted out, and she's an elderly woman, Mildred Carter, 75, and was just going across the street to her neighbor's house to get water. Because of the monies that are going to come in, because of the work of rewiring, she got a new water heater. There was a family that was living in a double-wide trailer without central air, with kids, 3 generations of families. They now have central air for the first time in their lives. This is life-changing work that would not be possible but for President Joe Biden. So my commitment to his reelection is that not only do I know what he is doing, I know what the other guy said he promises to do, which is to dismantle, disassociate, and destroy what is possible for the future. And so for me, there is no choice but to make certain that we reelect Joe Biden.
Right. And we are asking these questions because of the poor performance at the first presidential debate. Now, you say that any alternative, say you go to an open convention, is likely to lead to a divide among Democrats. And you say that the focus should be among Democrats, not infighting, but trying to defeat Trump. Any other nominee, and I say in quotes, won't have, according to you, the campaign infrastructure, resources, or significant national record. But sounds like Kamala Harris has all of that. So if Joe Biden does step down, would you support Harris to be the nominee?
I don't do hypotheticals when we are 3.5 months from an existential crisis in this country. We have a president who will become the nominee in mid-August, who will become the next president if we do the work between now and then. I support the Biden-Harris administration, but there is one person who is the nominee for president for the Democratic Party, and that is Joe Biden, and that is who I support.
Right. So I appreciate that answer. Now, one of the things that you've...
Wasn't enough, though.
You've...
not my first rodeo. Come on.
You've been crucial in turning the vote out in Georgia. In 2020, you turned got enough votes out to turn the state blue, to ensure that the Senate has a Democratic majority. And you said you don't do hypotheticals, but...
No, I didn't say ever, but go ahead.
But if...
I write books, so I do hypotheticals all the time. Just depends on the situation. But let's see if you can breach that.
So, if Biden stays on, polls show that currently people aren't as excited about going to vote for Joe Biden. Are you worried that there won't be enough of a turnout to be able to defeat Donald Trump?
People don't care about your politics. They care about their lives. They vote based on their needs. We need a president who has demonstrated for the last 3.5 years an assiduous commitment to saving our planet, and more importantly, saving our lives. We need someone who has demonstrated through word and deed the understanding of the crisis that we face in our environment, and also has a detailed and dedicated plan. The work of winning an election is not simply who is running. It's not just what's on the ballot, it's who's in the booth. And to get people into the booth, you have groups like Rewiring America, a nonpartisan organization that exists to tell people what's possible. When people know I can get an HVAC system so that I can stay cool in the sweltering heat of Seattle, which is a strange... when they know that in the winter, when delivered fuels start to increase in cost, and they now have an upgraded system that lets them stay warm in the winter without having to sacrifice health care for energy costs. That's the choice that we're asking people to make. President Biden is the right person to be on the ballot, but the work of winning an election is about who you get to show up to the booth, and that's the work of everyone who cares about the future of this country. And so I'm not concerned. I'm committed. And our job is to convince every person who shares that value system and wants to see that future to show up and do the same work and get more people to vote.
Yeah. I had the honor of serving in the Obama White House. And in 2012, we had economic data that showed that everything was getting better. And when we did polling, people felt like it wasn't getting better in their day-to-day lives. And today, inflation numbers came out showing that it's easing, setting up an opportunity for the Fed to do an interest rate cut. And so we talk about that in terms of macroeconomic issues. But at the kitchen table, it is a different story. And the thing that just to connect the dots here, the reason why this is very important to our political future and very important to our climate future is that electrification and making these decisions is anti-inflationary to people's day-to-day lives because they trade out a $500 bill for a $100 bill. But it's also anti-inflationary because the most inflationary force in the history of humankind is climate change.
So one of the things that has been surprising to me as somebody who lives in the UK watching the Inflation Reduction Act play out, there are so many things that are being done that are going to help reduce emissions, reduce inflation, reduce the bills that people pay for energy while making decarbonization happen. But they've still not been appreciated by people. People don't know the Inflation Reduction Act, most people, right? And you said you have this tool that has gone out to 1 million people, 1 million households that have used this tool to try and figure out how to electrify their homes. There are 100 million households in America. And so there is still a gap between doing, which is important, and showing to people what you have done, because that is what will get the vote to turn out. So how are you working to bridge that gap? Because that gap is very big.
It's big and it's important, and it is also common sense. Most people don't think about what's happening in Washington day in, day out. Most people don't read 7,000-page legislative texts, as compelling as they might be. People are just trying to make do. And then the other part of this is that we live in a status quo environment that is a fossil fuel environment. So when your furnace conks out or when your water heater stops working and you need to figure out what to do, again, you don't think about that stuff on a day in and day out basis. So when you call somebody to go replace it or fix it, what they tend to do is do a like-for-like swap. So the thing that has pipes in your house that connects to the pipe sticking out of your wall, when the contractor comes with their van, they have a thing that has pipes sticking out of the back to connect to the pipe sticking out of your wall. And if at that point in time you say, I heard something on a podcast about a heat pump, what's that? Like, that's not a great time to have that conversation. And so we need to cut through and get to people about the benefit and the value to them, but also get the friction out of the process so that it's easier. And that is what we are incredibly focused on. And the way we think about it is that our job is to make it easy for you. And the you in that phrase is anybody in the 129 million households in America. And for you, it is going to be different based on where you live, what your circumstances are. And we have to make it easy for the you in that context to be able to move forward.
Stacey, say the big question that we are grappling with right now. We move on from that. Joe Biden remains presidential nominee. What do you think the next 3 months should look like to get the vote out for Joe Biden?
So it's conversations like this. It's explaining to the people who understand what's at stake what they can do. It's making sure that people know about Rewiring's home calculator so they can figure it out. It's making sure they know that they can take advantage of state rebates that are now coming online. It's connecting the dots between the pain they feel and the opportunity to solve that pain. That's what canvassing is. That's what organizing is. That's what campaigning is. And so we have a lot of work to do. To your point, not as many people know about it because it's shocking, but in government, things move slowly. Yeah. And so even though the Inflation Reduction Act passed in 23, it has taken time to deploy that much money. Those dollars are now coming online. So part of the responsibility for anyone who is of good conscience is to share this information. When you're on social media, talk about what you know. People get most of their information about kitchen table decisions from people that they know. And so part of our responsibility, one of the ways we not only proselytize about the IRA, but proselytize about the climate future we can have, is by convincing average folks who are voters to talk to people who may not be voters, who may not think they need to be voters, but who want their lives to be better. And they need to understand that if you vote, you get this. If you don't vote, you lose this. And right now, people don't know what's at stake, and so that's the next 3 months, connecting the dot between what's at stake and what is possible. And we have one person who is making possibility real, and that's the person that we're going to support for president.
And Ari, now you're a nonpartisan, you're leading Rewiring America, which is nonpartisan. There is a real specter of Donald Trump getting elected and a bunch of climate policies being dismantled. So if that happens, how are you preparing Rewiring America to do the work that it does right now?
Well, I guess I would just say the importance of making these policies relevant for people at their kitchen tables is also a very important strategy for protecting the policies, because people tend to pay attention to how the math works out at their kitchen table, and if the math is working out because of a set of policies, they tend to want to keep those policies. We've seen that over and over again. There has been, in solar, the investment tax credit, how many times has it been going away in U.S. policy as it expires? And it gets continued, and it gets continued because there is a benefit to people. So our job is to do the work of what you were just saying, of connecting it to people and making people understand the policy, because that is in essence, the political insurance around what these investments are.
Now, we have seen a term of Donald Trump in power. If he does come to power again, and you've been quite forthright about what it could mean for America, what is at stake, not just in climate, but beyond it. In the op-ed you say, former President Donald Trump has made it clear his plan is to be dictator on day one. How does your work change if Trump returns to White House?
One, we do the work to make certain that doesn't happen, and part of that is to explain what is possible. Under the current term, or the just completed term of the Supreme Court, the Chevron decision, the Chevron deference decision, means that the EPA, the Clean Water Act, all of the all of the work to protect our climate could be vitiated with the stroke of a pen. A lesser-known decision was the Snyder decision, which says that it's now legal to bribe local officials, that the federal law that precludes that bribery is now permitted. Well, if you're looking at public utility commissions that are making decisions, if you don't have oversight and they can get money, I invite all of you to engage in one hypothetical of what could possibly happen. And so I think our responsibility is to, as Ari said, we've got to connect people to these moments. The way you preclude a Trump administration is by doing the work to re-elect the current administration. But more importantly, we've got to take ourselves out of the conversation of what's happening in Washington and take it back to what can happen in my life. If there's the removal of a regulatory body that says that you shouldn't have to breathe in dirty air, if there is the removal of a regulatory body that tells companies they can't pollute where you live, that's a real consequence. And it's not a hypothetical. The law now permits that to happen, and it is only those who are in power who can stop it and make it not so. And so our job is to absolutely ensure that we explain what could happen, and we also explain how you stop it from becoming so. It's not rocket science, but it is hard work. And the work of telling people this is the work that Rewiring is doing, not through the lens of partisan decision, but through the conversation of power, because ultimately that's what all this is about. This is a power dynamic, and we need to decide who has the power, us or them. And by us, I mean the people who need to be able to take care of themselves, their families, their lives, and their communities. And if we believe that we have that power, then we can make the choices that makes that power real.
So, Ari, final question. Say Joe Biden does get elected, and 2025, you have a second term. You were gunning for the Inflation Reduction Act in the first term. What kind of big major policy would you want to see in the next term that could make electrification easier?
Well, it's not just at the federal level. It's across the country. Stacey mentioned PUCs. To engage in the hypothetical, if you have a machine that you can buy that is 3 to 5 times more efficient than the fossil fuel counterpart, and it costs you more on your energy bills, you can ask yourself why that's happening, and it's happening because of how the energy prices are set between fossil fuels and electricity prices. That's a choice that's being made. It's a choice that gets made regionally, a choice that gets made locally. So we need to really be focused on getting the friction out for the household, and the incentives are a piece of that, and there's more that can be done federally. But we also need to be really focused on pushing the cost down for households. That is because of choices that we're making at a federal, state, local level from a policy perspective that is artificially inflating costs, creating friction that inflates cost, creating sort of less transparency that inflates cost. And there's a bunch of work to do in all of that.
So, I mean, the climate problem is really complicated, and you have to do the nuts and bolts, and that's really important. But the vision is important too. So I haven't heard a big policy that you would want in the next term. Do you have one of those in your back pocket that you're pushing for?
I think the big policy vision is making it easier for people. And because that is step one in the Inflation Reduction Act was a bunch of carrots that were important that people can access. But there is a lot of work to do to make it easier. And I think the way I would describe it is that if we think about the household as the consumer of the policy and are focused on the household as the consumer of the policy, then the policy vision should be to make it easy for you. And anything that touches that is sort of in the lines, and we should be working on.
Thank you, Aries. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Sally Jewell, former U.S. Secretary of the Interior and former CEO of REI, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Zara Hershey.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much, and I'm so excited to have you here. You know, I know that the name of this is the business value of climate, but we have to start with this little thing that's happening November, you know, this election. And so I wanted to start by just asking your perspective, or in your own words, what are the climate stakes of this election?
The climate stakes of this election could not be higher. To go backwards is not acceptable for the planet. And I can't say enough about the importance of continuing the progress that has been made over the last 3 years, especially the passage of these large bills, bipartisan infrastructure bill, Inflation Reduction Act. But if you look in it, finally, we are investing in the things that need to be invested in to where the U.S. can lead. And if that gets unwound or slowed down, I'm really afraid for the future of our planet.
The word you used backstage for a Trump presidency was terrifying. Can you elaborate a little bit more on why that would be, and specifically what you're watching? And in part because you've watched this before. You were Interior Secretary. You put some rules in place, including rules to track and bring down methane emissions on oil and gas operations on public lands. And then you saw it repealed, or at least paused and get caught up in courts, and there was a pause before it took effect. So what are you worried particularly about this next time around if he is elected?
Yeah, let me just say, it's hard to change regulations. It is not easy. You got to prove your case. You've got to do open public meetings. You've got to do a lot of things. So if you want to stop the venting of methane, which is about as obvious a thing you should do, which of course doesn't gain royalties for the American people or anything else, it just goes up in the atmosphere and accelerates climate change. You have to go through a lot of hoops to do that. Trump took credit for undoing a lot of stuff he didn't actually undo, because he wanted to get credit for it, but they didn't go through the process, and so it got thrown out in court. In some cases, those laws take effect and they continue until a challenge happens, and there was quite a bit of that. So people said, oh, you must be just devastated by what the Trump administration is doing. I said, I'm devastated by what the Trump administration is saying, but they're not actually doing what they said they are doing because they can't, because it's getting tied up in the courts. A second Trump presidency, more people in the judiciary that may look unfavorably on the kinds of laws that have given us a country that has clean air and clean water, with heroes of mine who's a Republican, the late Bill Ruckelshaus, who brought us mileage standards in cars in the Nixon administration. I mean, these are things that can be unwound in a second Trump presidency with a very different ethos of the judiciary system. So, I mean, I worry about that. I really worry. So, yes, I am terrified. I'm not terrified about a blowhard and the words that he uses. I am terrified about the system coming unraveled, and I'm terrified about the scientists that we all rely on for our weather forecasting, for our stream gauges, for hurricanes, for earthquakes, all of those people that I worked with in government that are so critical, who are vulnerable with the words that candidate Trump is using right now, which is there's so many public servants. If they are the deep state, then sign me up.
So, is Biden the best person to beat Trump?
You know, I have no idea, right? I mean, he'd had a crappy debate. There's no question about that. If Biden or another Democrat is elected, and the kinds of people that are working in government that understand these issues are enabled to continue to do the work that they do, we are fine. If the election is lost, we are not fine. And, you know, I read the same thing that you're reading. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know Joe Biden is a very good man, He's an ethical person. The people around him are ethical. They know what they're doing, and that will continue, whether it's President Biden or somebody else. And that is just really, really important, I think, to the future of our planet. And I'm not, I don't think I'm overstating the case. It's really, really important.
Are you concerned about his age?
I'm concerned about his ability to beat Donald Trump because of what's happening in the polling, of course. I don't think age is the determining factor. I know many people that are older than Joe Biden who are amazing. A number of them have been my mentors. So I don't think it's age, but we got to get a person in the White House that continues these policies. That is really, really important.
So we talked a little bit about how between a Democratic and a Republican administration, what we've seen is there can be this wild swing in policies. And we talked a little bit about the methane rule in particular that you had just worked so hard on. I'm curious, if you can elaborate, you're talking a little bit about what it means from a regulation standpoint, but obviously huge swings in regulation and policy send signals to business. So how do you see businesses responding to this, and what is sort of the challenge sort of inherent in that if they cannot, have that confidence that the rules that they are going to be in place and having to follow are still going to be there in 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, the key for businesses don't hate regulations. They hate uncertainty. That is the killer of business. If I'm making an investment that is going to last for 50 years or 30 years, I want to make sure that I'm going to be able to get a return on that investment and the rules aren't going to change. And, I worked in the oil industry early in my career. I worked as a banker with many companies in the natural resource sector. I'm on the boards of companies now, and they don't mind playing by the rules. They can't have rules that keep changing back and forth. And I'll give you a good example. We worked really hard with governors and wildlife agencies from 11 western states, 7 core states, on the protection of habitat called the sagebrush sea. And Republican governors, Democratic governors, administrations from all political stripes working together to say, how do we do this? Because the governors did not want to lose control of their ability to develop, okay? Because of their hard work to protect these landscapes, the Fish and Wildlife Service said this species does not need to be listed as endangered, okay? When that happened, the oil companies and everything heaved a sigh of relief because they had the rule book and they knew where they could develop or put transmission lines in or other things. They knew what they had to do and the areas they had to avoid. When Trump came into office and Ryan Zinke was in his brief tenure in the position that I used to hold, he said he was going to undo those rules. The very Republican governor of Wyoming, Matt Mead, who worked hard with us on this, went to the Trump administration and said, please don't. The oil companies are coming to me saying, oh no, don't reopen this. We have a deal. And the Trump administration tried to undermine it anyway. They had not been successful, at least at that point, but the oil companies are coming to the Republican governors saying, no, 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 we had a deal. We knew the rule book. And that's a good illustration. So businesses hate chaos. They need predictability. And, it's another good example. And I will say there are many, many great Republicans that I've worked with. I don't have a problem with the GOP. I have a problem with the Trump administration and the people that are acolytes of his.
That being said, big business isn't like victimless in just seeing these changes happen. They, as you said, they can reach out to governors. They have a role in sort of being able, maybe not if they don't want to fight for a particular role, you can say fight for certainty. And so what would you recommend, to the many people here are coming from businesses about, I guess, the power that they have in kind of maintaining or securing that kind of certainty?
Yeah, I think businesses have to be at the table. I mean, there's a saying that it just couldn't be more true. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I have found, when I was leading REI, we took for granted public lands that our customers enjoyed recreating on. but we weren't necessarily at the table lobbying for the importance of those public lands or the support for them in the way the oil companies were at the table lobbying for a continuation of the subsidies they have that give them an unfair advantage to drill for oil and gas or coal. And so said, you know, we may not have the money of the oil and gas industry, but we do have grassroots support, and we need to be at the table. We need to reinforce these courageous members of Congress who are trying to do the right thing for the environment and the future and give them our support and put grassroots support behind it. So if you can't compete in the money game, which is very difficult to do, you can compete in the discomfort game, in the reputational risk game, in making sure that people are rewarded for doing the right thing, our elected officials and our public servants, by thanking them for what they do and not just asking for favors. And I think businesses have to be at the table. And I think when I was first CEO of REI, the National Chamber of Commerce came and asked me to join, and I said, you know, why would I want to join? You spend about $400 million a year lobbying against a lot of the things that are really important for my business. And they said, well, why did you meet with us if that was the case? I said, because I'm a business leader, and you need to know that preventing taxes and undermining regulations is not in the best interests of many businesses. And if we didn't have this meeting, I wouldn't have an opportunity to tell you that. And they said, would you like to be on our board?
So you have worked in a lot of different industries, and I think it's one of your superpowers, right? That you have this huge history in working in different fields in this intersection of business and climate. And one of the things we were talking about is if you want to be a big, reputable company today, there's some things you just have to do on climate. Basically, this floor of climate action, I'm not talking about the leaders who are leading the game, but like everyone has to meet this floor. And kind of, can you talk about where you see that floor is today and how that's shifted in the past 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, totally. I mean, being involved in addressing climate change and sustainability as a business, in my view, is table stakes today. You must be there. At REI, you know, I would say the organization was early to the game, and it may be obvious why an REI or a Patagonia is because of the nature of our businesses. But I will say it was harder then. It's not like it's not hard now, but it was harder then because in many cases, you may be, in being sustainable, you may be using a different product that, you know, like PFAS chemicals is a good example right now that may not be as effective. You may be using recycled materials that cost more to manufacture. You may be following your own moral compass that is inconsistent with what your competitors are doing, and therefore by doing the right thing, you're being placed at a competitive disadvantage. Yeah. I think that thoughtful regulations that align environmental interests with economic success are exactly where we need to go. Mileage standards in cars, great example. Set a target, put it far enough out, work with the auto companies to get there, and then we pay less in gas, we get better mileage, and the planet wins as well. Government that works in partnership with business can help get there.
Yeah.
At REI, we put solar panels on stores, but we did it in states where they had incentives to do that because it was uneconomic to do it. It's become now more economic because the prices of panels have come down and so on. So when you can work collectively on a pathway to where you need to go, and you don't, I mean, you talked about the pendulum swinging back and forth, very, very difficult for people in government to have to deal with, the career staffers that are having to deal with this, and for business. But if you work collectively with business and you say, here's where we're going at this point, and here's where we're going at this point, now let's work collectively to get there, you can put the kinds of rules in place that reward the right behavior, and that's really critical. I can give you a quick example if we have time.
Yeah.
Something that we worked on in the Mojave Desert called the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. Actually, the catalyst for it was the Nature Conservancy, State of California, Bureau of Land Management, worked collectively to say, let's drive solar and wind energy, not make the same mistakes that we've made in other development of oil and gas and other minerals, and drive it to the right places. Deconflicted for tribal rights and sacred sites, deconflicted for critical animal habitat, close to disturbance, not in some rich person's view that they're going to, argue about. Do the EIS in advance, and then say to the companies, because California had renewable energy standards, utilities have to do it, go to these areas, we will give you your permit within 90 days. That's money in the bank for those businesses. They have to produce the power because of the California regulations, and so the utilities will give them a purchase power supply contract. With that, they can go to their bank for a loan, they can accelerate renewable energy, and they can do it faster because they went to these areas because they were pre-cleared by government. That, to me, is really good government and thoughtful regulation.
The Biden administration has put in these new rules, is providing more money, but at the end of the day, I think a big thing that's come up as a theme at this festival is the transition to net zero is still hard.
Really hard.
And what do you see as maybe one or two of the most central challenges to companies, not the ones that are thinking about the floor, but the ones that are really kind of hit to the ceiling, that they still are encountering, and how they can move through those challenges?
I mean, one of the toughest things is we are not paying for the cost of putting carbon in our atmosphere. There is no price to any of us as consumers of our use of fossil fuels, of our increase in carbon, and the technology is not yet there to remove carbon. And I know there's some folks here like Banyu Carbon, based here in Seattle, that's working hard on that, and lots of technologies. And that's really, really important. But we have got to reduce our consumption levels. And I think one way to do that is economic incentives to do that. And there are winners and losers, and rural communities get hurt. And if we don't think about how do we address rural communities or agriculture that depends on it, we won't get that done. But that's actually really, really critical. And until we really start at least shining a spotlight on the true impact, I don't think people are going to begin to change their behaviors. I think if it doesn't hit them in the pocketbook in some way, we're not going to change. So, big challenge.
Until there's that true cost there.
Well, I mean, look outside. It's a little cooler today than it has been. Look what happened just in Texas.
Yeah.
Look at the forest fires. Our planet is in trouble, and it's telling us something.
And yet so often, as someone's been watching the coverage about Hurricane Beryl, they're not often seeing the link being made to climate change with any particular extreme weather. And, what do you wish they were saying? What could you say to that?
Well, I think, let me just say, there is an ecosystem here. There are climate activists who make people uncomfortable, and they are really, really important. There are businesses who are on the cutting edge of this that are trying to do the right thing. There's new ones. They deserve our support. They deserve our business. There are some bad actors. We need to let them know they're bad actors. We need to make them feel uncomfortable. I'm a fan of Greta Thunberg. I'm a fan of the people who at times make me feel uncomfortable, right? I'm a fan of the nonprofit organizations that sued me 3 times a week in government because they serve an important role. I'd rather they would have allowed my fish biologists to do their work in fisheries, but I understand because I was really happy they were there during Trump. So we are all part of an ecosystem that needs to work together. And we have levers that are going to be really important to pull. And I think we need to pull all those levers now because, it's a 5-alarm fire.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it. Let's give a round of applause to Sally Jewell. Thank you so much.
Please welcome to the stage Allison Abner, executive producer and producer of Bad River, Quanah Chasing Horse, land protector and fashion model, and Mary Mazzio, director of Bad River, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Aaron Rutkoff.
Thank thank you very much for being here with us today, and thank all of you also. Before we begin talking, I want to show everybody the film that you've made, Bad River, or at least the trailer. So let's go to the trailer first.
This is a story of the Bad River people and their home on Lake Superior.
Our people have been here for millennia.
They've had to fight for who they are.
And the Ojibwe have been resisting ever since.
There was a black car that used to ride around. We see that coming, we'd run.
They basically just grab kids and take them off to these boarding schools.
They were modeled after prison systems.
It was a genocidal project.
The whole idea was your culture is primitive.
The oppression, the racism just hit a pinnacle.
It was all built up.
You punk. I thought Native people would get killed.
There's always some kind of threat.
They've had to fight to protect their land.
Seems improbable that a pipe would be hanging in midair.
That's a ticking time bomb.
When the meander reaches the pipeline,
Apocalyptic.
If it breaks, you know, this is gonna pour right into Lake Superior. And that's bad.
It is the grandmother of the Great Lakes. It is the freshwater stronghold of planet Earth.
Trying to shut down a pipeline, that's a major endeavor.
It's a David and Goliath type of situation, right?
You gotta stop it.
My little tribe is protecting water for the planet.
It'll be one hell of a fight.
This is a story of defiance.
We're gonna protect our water. To die for. If we have to.
So now that they've seen the trailer, before we begin, Mary, can you tell us where everyone can see the film after today's session?
Yes, thank you for asking, and great to be here, Aaron. So we just came out of theaters. The film amazingly lasted in theaters for 2 months. Shocking for a documentary. We are going to be debuting on Peacock in November. And in the meanwhile, there are special events. You can do pay-per-view, and if everyone comes to our website, badriverfilm.com, we would greatly appreciate it.
Excellent. Quan, I want to start with you. You're one of the voices of the film. You and Edward Norton are the two narrators. And you also, we have two filmmakers and an activist on the stage. You're involved in the work of land guardianship. And I wanted to know sort of how that work brought you into this project.
Yeah, I just want to thank Mary for, giving me the opportunity. I think it's really, really important to show solidarity and stand with one another. There's so many Indigenous people, across the world that are facing similar threats. I'm from Alaska, and, obviously the Bad River tribe is not from Alaska, but that fight is our fight. There's so many things that are happening in Alaska that are so related, and, there's so many nuances of, these projects and things that are threatening our ways of life and our people, our identity as Indigenous people. But it's also like when I go home and I'm seeing the threat and I'm seeing the impact that it's making, and then I go somewhere else and I enter another Indigenous community, it's almost the same thing. Yeah. And so it's really important, as a land protector, to stand in solidarity with my brothers and sisters that are, enduring the same kind of pain and hardship of losing land, language. Everything is so interconnected. It's so hard to talk about one thing without bringing up another. And so I'm just very blessed to be a part of this project. It's such an incredible film. Everyone needs to watch it. Mary did an amazing job. And the voices in there are just so powerful, and I feel so honored to be a part of it.
And I'm wondering for you what the emotional experience was like of learning about the history of the Bad River Band through reading the script. What was that experience like for you? Is that the first you kind of encountered the situation?
She was mad.
I was so mad, you guys. Yeah, it was actually pretty emotional. There were actually moments where I had to stop and read and kind of process what I was reading. I knew of a lot of these issues happening in other Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, also known as North America. But I'm also so focused on what's going on back in my home. And, reading that and really understanding this issue and being a voice, it really opened my eyes to so much more. And it was definitely like an emotional experience reading the script. I mean, at one point I stopped and I looked at Mary and I was like, I am so mad right now. Like, I cannot believe I'm reading this and this is real. Like, people are saying these things and this is what's happening. And it's so heartbreaking, but you also see the power come through those Indigenous people and through the film.
So, Mary and Allison, I want to ask you about the history in the film, but I first want to, before we go to like the deep history, which I'm really interested in, I want to ask you if you can kind of situate where, like in the film itself, the condition of the pipeline that's at the center of this, that there is a Enbridge pipeline that's running through the Bad River Band's land. Can you talk to us about like the condition of it today and the precariousness of that pipeline that's at the center of this?
So, Al, I'll start. And I think, you know, here we have a Canadian pipeline that serves Canadian consumers primarily. It was installed in the 50s without the Bad River Band's consent. It cuts through the heart of the reservation. And here we fast forward 70 years. There are two salient points about this. Easements for about 3 miles of the pipeline corridor expired 10 years ago. The terms of the contract, the easement agreement, required the pipeline operator to cease and remove the infrastructure. A. B. Today, the Bad River is changing her course. She's meandering. And the pipeline, when it was originally installed, was about 150 feet away from the water. Today, it's 17 feet. When it hits the pipeline, there is a profound risk of rupture. And the Bad River Band, here is this tiny community, and they are fighting so hard to protect Lake Superior, because if this ruptures, it's in Lake Superior in a matter of hours. And as the former chairman said to me, we are using maximum effort, not just for ourselves, we are safeguarding this precious resource of fresh water for all Americans. And then we were at an event a couple of weeks ago, and he said, you know, what we're doing is our patriotic duty. Our patriotic duty, because it's in service to this country. And I thought, are we profanity-free here?
Well, so,
Holy
not. so let's, in the context of patriotism and the history of the United States, I mean, one thing I found very interesting about your film is that to tell this story of a pipeline that, what did you say, is 50 years old?
Oh, no, 70.
70 years old. You go all the way back into like the 1800s and even before that. And it's interesting to me, I watch a lot of climate films and climate-adjacent films. I'm a juror in our Green Docs competition that's part of tomorrow's programming in the afternoon. Often there's this move where you start with like the history of climate change. You go to the Industrial Revolution, and it's a similar scope of time that you want people to engage with. Why did you feel it was so important to start with the entire history of the United States and the Western colonization? Why was that context necessary?
So I'm going to hit it over to Allison in a second, but what happened was we began interviewing elders. Yeah. And what was amazing about their story, they wanted to talk about the pipeline, the challenges with Enbridge today, but they said, did you know about the mining battle? And did you know about the walleye wars? And they went back in time to showcase not just the challenges, but their resistance and their resilience and how they fought back at every stage. And I think that was like the film meandered, because it went from a pipeline film into a historical retrospective. And I'm going to say my partner in crime, Allison Abner, who wrote for Narcos and West Wing, was with me every edit, every step of the way. And Allison said, Mary, we need to include the Dawes Act. And I was like,
eyes glazed over.
Yawn.
Why did we need the Dawes Act?
Well, you know, kind of the nexus for all of this, for what Mary's talking about the pipeline, and what Kwana's talking about you know, all the issues that are affecting, you know, tribes across the continent. It's no accident, and that is the historical policy of the United States government. And there's two pieces to it. One we kind of saw here with the Carlisle Indian School. I'm descendant from Stockbridge, Muncie, and 2 generations of my family went to Carlisle. And I, you know, grew up with stories about it because they had a famous football team that some family members played on. But when I was on the West Wing, I decided I really wanted to understand, like, how did land get, how did they get dispossessed from their land, and sort of how did we get from there to here? Mm-hmm. And so I called spoke to the chairman of the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe here in Wisconsin, and he said, you need to look at the Dawes Act. And it was, mid-1800s. It was really a congressional act that essentially divided up all of the reservations that had been, through treaties had been agreed upon. And as they were divided and kind of sliced up into these smaller plots, each Indian family was given one plot, and the rest were sold at auction by the United States government. And that is how so many people who live in different parts of the United States, that is how they came into possession of the land. And the mythology, and one of the things that Mary and I talked about very early on, was that we needed to kind of dispel a lot of the mythology around, Little House on the Prairie, and, just sort of the pioneering, that people just plopped their, they saw empty land and plopped their thing and built a log cabin, and that it's like, no, this land, whole nations were dispossessed of their land. And in tandem, happening at the same time, it was mandatory for all children to go to Carlisle. And people do not understand that this was, you had to go for 5 years. And the whole point...
A boarding school.
A boarding school in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which had been an Army barrack that was run by a Colonel Platt from the United States Army. And literally the kids were not allowed to speak their language. They, dress, have any of their customs. So it was meant as what's called an assimilation project, but it was so thorough and so devastating that after the kids would come back, they could not speak to their parents. Their parents often didn't even recognize them. So those two things together, and what Kwana is saying, that this has affected many generations later, is no accident. So
just real quick, just adding on to that, it just also shows that even today, why Indigenous people are so dehumanized. The quote of the schools, the residential schools back then, was "kill the Indian," because we weren't even seen as people, "save the man." So "kill the Indian, save the man" was what the motto was for those schools, and that alone kind of tells you what those schools, did to our people.
Kwana, I want to ask you to help draw some comparisons between the Line 5 fight and some of the work that you're involved in your community. Line 5 has, I think, somewhat of a lower profile than some other big Indigenous fights against fossil fuel infrastructure. Can you talk about your experience working in the Arctic? And the Willow Project is one that I think has drawn a lot more attention in political circles. Can you talk to us a bit about where things are there?
Yeah. I feel like we're kind of in this weird stage where we're waiting for something to happen, but we're feeling confident as of now. There was so much hard work and so much time. I mean, people don't even realize this has been a fight that's been going on for generations. I'm the 4th generation to be fighting, these corporations and these extractive industries. And that's insane to think about. I don't want to have a kid and think that they're going to have to be the next to continue that fight. They should be able to breathe clean air and drink clean water. That should be our number one right. But for my experience, I've lobbied so much in Congress. I've been in the room of the House of Reps watching them vote on a bill, whether or not they were going to protect the Arctic Refuge from drilling or move forward. And it was the first time I'd actually really seen these reps it's split down the middle. There's the Dems on one side, Republicans on the other. And I was just up there watching them, and it turned into a debate. There were people that weren't even from Alaska telling Alaskans what we should do and what we should do with our land. And it was so hard to sit there and try to explain to them and rehumanize ourselves and tell them that we are people living this life in Alaska where we now can't fish. Our people are banned from fishing, yet they're letting commercial fishermen go fish. There's so many things and so many threats, and having to sit there and defend that and ask for basic human rights is insane. And so being in those spaces, it was so eye-opening to seeing how the world saw us and how the government saw us, and like, you know, showing up. And it's not just showing up politically, like protesting and coming to these conferences and talking. Like, it has been, you know, ongoing hard work, and we're getting somewhere. I mean, they're not drilling in the Arctic Refuge right now, and the Willow Project is kind of like on hold, but there's still processes and policies that they're trying to maneuver around so that they can just go straight in.
I just wanted to ask one more question before I do throw over to you on the same topic, but because the Willow Project, today I think a lot of questions for the political speakers that have been on before have been about the current state of the election and Joe Biden. And before the debate through these big open questions, there was a big concern that people who were aligned with climate or environmental activists would be disenchanted with the Biden administration because of the Willow Project. And I'm wondering if that setback, or that, which I'm sure was something you didn't want to see happen, their authorization of the Willow Project, did that cause you to question your support for the Biden administration?
Of course. I mean, I don't think a single Indigenous person actually fully supports a single living entity of the U.S. government. I mean, this government doesn't even see us as people still. Like, we're not even considered, you know, our voices are barely being heard at that level. So yeah, I don't trust the government at all. But I will say those policies are so important, you know, and despite that huge heartbreak, I mean, you know, it is something we grieve. Indigenous people grieve when we lose land. When we lose these fights, we grieve, because it's not just like, oh man, like that sucks that's happening. No, like this really does affect us in our livelihoods, and it's also a big part of our identity and who we are as people. You know, this is a statistic that we see get tossed around a lot, and I've said this so many times, but not a lot of people know it yet. And it's 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by Indigenous people, and we only take up 5% of the world's population. That's an insane statistic. And if you think about it, like the reason why we have, you know, Yosemite, Arctic Refuge, all of these beautiful wild places that we can escape to is because Indigenous people have been putting their lives at risk at the front lines defending those lands.
That was great. I want to bring it over to you.
Yeah, not to, you know, hammer the Dawes Act into the ground.
But she will.
Right. And I'm going to toss it to Mary, but at the heart of this, and so much of what the major kind of overarching theme of the movie is about sovereignty, which is the ability for that community, for that tribal community, to decide what happens with their land, what goes in it, what goes on it, who lives on it. And again, you know, and Mary will talk about kind of what's happening with the pipeline now, and there's, you know, a legal struggle, that there's a legal fight. I mean, and the resources that it takes up for people in these communities to have to just be able to say, this is what we do and don't want on our land. Just as, I mean, it's kind of unfathomable for any of us to think that if there were a pipeline going through our backyard, that we wouldn't fight it, that we wouldn't want to,
Yeah, exactly. And you said before, the fight that the Bad River is waging has been low profile. And obviously there's been some press with our film. There will be greater press as we head towards the fall. But therein lies the problem. And that happens across the country. It is very rare to have a Standing Rock situation. Right. It is very rare for an Indigenous community, as Kwana said, fighting for centuries. How often do you hear about those fights? Mm-hmm. And here the Bad River Band is, and I think they've expended $5+ million to bring this to trial. There was a trial, amazingly. I mean, most Native communities cannot afford that bill.
Yeah, let's like spoil your film here. Can you talk about the end of the film, which, you know, culminates in this big court battle? To me, it's fascinating because it's a case where there is such clear documentation about who should control the land that you show going back into deep history. So, you know, kind of tell us how the court battle that just played out went and what happened.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. So the federal district court judge in Wisconsin ruled that Enbridge was in a state of trespass, right? They simply didn't have the right to operate. You'd think that would be sort of clear, that's the end of it.
Well, because it's in legal terms, it's equitable. I'm a recovering lawyer. Sorry, it's really irritating to everyone I know. But it's equitable relief. So the judge said, well, we need to consider the impact on Canadian consumers. And what's fascinating is this is not a case about oil. It's not. We're a net exporter of oil. This is a case about a piece of infrastructure that no longer has the right to be in the place where it's in. And so right now, Enbridge, the judge did rule in Bad River's favor, but said Enbridge needs to shut down. I'm going to give you 3 years so as not to disrupt the energy markets. 3 years, it should have been, 18 months would have been fine. There's going to be a minimal disruption. Enbridge, of course, has appealed the decision.
Right? Can I ask you, I know you said you didn't want to have to do this, but can you give Enbridge's point of view? Like, what do they argue?
Well, Enbridge has an oil point of view. And as I just said, this is a story about infrastructure. Right. And it's a story about business interruption. Let's call it what it is. Enbridge's position is we have easements. Okay, they expired. We have other agreements that allow us to continue operating until 2046. We should be able to continue operating. Now, I'm going to say that is their position. Their position is lots of people are dependent upon that oil.
Right, that it would be disruptive for consumers.
But it's really, as I mentioned, it'll be disruptive for Enbridge because we have so much, right, like there's not an oil problem.
How many barrels go through that?
540,000 barrels of oil
and
per
how
day.
much do they make off of line fill?
Ooh, good question. Aaron, note to self.
I think these are great, yeah.
The court documents reveal that $600 million per year of free cash flow is generated by Line 5. And it's 71 years old, so they've amortized the line over and over and over and over. It is a cash cow.
How much did the band get for having that easement there?
So for the first 40 years, I think it was less than $5,000, maybe $10,000 for the... So effectively, it was a gift from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to Enbridge for the first 40 years. In the 90s, there was an agreement where the BIA said, okay, we're going to give you a little bit more, recognize your sovereignty a little bit more. And the band agreed to $800,000 for 50 years for like one set of parcel. And then the other parcels were 20 years.
So it's a big disparity between the money that the company is making and whatever.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, these are sophisticated cats up there in Canada. And the agreement ended. Like, there's full stop. And so...
So I want to ask two last questions, as we have about 2 minutes left here. Now, one of the big questions I have as an editor of climate journalism is the extent to which courts can be a venue that brings about climate change, or counteracts climate change. After studying this situation and following the case through the courts, do you feel more or less hopeful that courts can be a venue for
I would say Judge Conley is apoplectic about the potential of a rupture that could happen with the next big flood. He is very well aware of the problem. And he's very, very worried about it. Now it's before the Seventh Circuit, and my hunch is this is going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. If the ban doesn't run out of money, A, or B, if there's not a rupture in the meanwhile.
And then, Kwan, I want to give you the last word here, because you are the activist on the stage. You know, people hearing this discussion and after today going to watch the film, what do you want them to take away? How do you want an audience of people who are here because they share a concern for climate change to, what should they be doing from your point of view as an activist?
Yeah, I just encourage people to really get connected with the community that you are residing in. It's really important to recognize the Indigenous people of where you're at. A lot of the time we just go somewhere and we're like, oh, we're in Seattle, but, there's Indigenous people everywhere. There's Native communities everywhere, and try to find a way to show up for one another. I mean, really just start within your own community, and see what you can do for them. You can try to show up everywhere else, and yes, we need that. Like, that is so important, but we also need people to, start really showing up on the front lines, because it can't just be us putting our lives at risk. We need more people. We need allies, and we need people to show up for each other. And with this film, I really hope people learn from it and understand our history. Because like you said, this film turned into like an oil pipeline film to a history learning lesson. And, you know, I know a lot of Native history, but I myself even learned a lot through the film. And so it's very informative. I really hope you learn, and I really hope you take that information and share it. And I really hope moving forward that you are really connected to your humanity the way Indigenous people are. And I really hope that you see yourself as a part of nature, not less than or more than, because when you do that, we end up in these kinds of positions. So
that's a perfect place to leave it. Thank you so much, and please watch Bad River on Peacock.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Willow Defabaugh, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Atmos.
My climate story began where I suspect many of yours did, with a crisis. It was 2017, Donald Trump was president, wildfires were consuming the West Coast, climate change seemed like it was reaching a fever pitch, and beneath it all, I felt a restless anxiety in my soul. So I did what anyone would do. I quit my job. I quit my job that I had spent a career working for as a magazine editor, and I left in search of answers, trying to make sense of it all and my purpose in it. And that time took me all over the world. I spent a year seeking. I studied in ashrams in India. I sat in ceremony in the jungles of Central America. I became an avid practitioner and teacher of meditation. I was determined to protect my peace from the problems that were plaguing our world. Around the same time, I was introduced by a mutual friend to someone who was interested in starting a publication focused on sustainability and climate. Now, I was fairly certain that my time in the publishing industry was over. However, this did speak to something deep within me. When I was a child, I actually told my parents that I wanted to grow up to be the editor-in-chief of an environmental magazine. Strangely specific, but my father is here somewhere and can verify. The person that I met that day ended up becoming my business partner and co-founder of Atmos magazine. We dreamed of a publication that would bring together poets and artists with climate scientists and journalists. We were aligned around a shared question as to why storytelling around the climate crisis had always been so data-driven and clinical, rather than telling stories that speak to what this crisis really is, a crisis of heart. What began as a passion project quickly bloomed into something much bigger than we had expected. We were working with environmental heroes like Jane Goodall and Vandana Shiva, as well as artists like Yoko Ono and Maggie Rogers, bringing people together for a common cause and a common love for this planet. But even as Atmos bloomed, I still felt a restlessness within me. More and more, my time was feeling split between making the magazine and what I considered to be my spiritual life. As I prepared to make a choice between these two paths, life stepped in and made one for me when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. I decided that it was time to fully invest in Atmos. My partner and I gave all of our energy to it. We expanded with a global team. We began expanding across platforms. And I started writing a weekly newsletter called The Overview, one of the early editions of which went viral. In it, I drew comparisons and parallels between this virus, which was impacting our ability to breathe, the fires in the Amazon, the lungs of the planet, and the fact that in many traditional medicine systems, the lungs are where we store grief. Grief that we were seeing well to the surface all over the world in so many different arenas, including in my own home. In lockdown, with nowhere to go and nowhere to run, I finally looked in the mirror and confronted what was the source of my anxiety for so many years. I had not been living authentically as myself, that I had been living in a state of dissociation. So I came out as a trans woman. I began hormone therapy, and I started the messy process of metamorphosis. In the chrysalis of quarantine, I liquefied so that I might truly live. And I poured myself into my writing during that time. Each week for the overview, I would look to a different aspect of nature for some lesson I could tether myself to during this incredibly transformative time, both for myself and so many others. What could hummingbirds teach us about living lightly? What could frogs teach us about vulnerability and how it feels to breathe through such sensitive skin? What could ravens and crows, which hold funerals for the dead, teach us about the universality of grief? Over time, science became my spirituality. And it started to slowly dawn on me that if science is the study of life, and spirituality is the study of the sacred, why wouldn't they be one and the same? At the same time as my transition progressed and I embodied myself more physically, so too did I embody myself spiritually. And I started to understand that spirituality is not about escaping from the world and its problems. It is about becoming more deeply rooted in the world. We speak about the climate crisis as if it is a problem to be solved rather than a wound to be healed. And what is a wound if not a separation? Flesh parted from flesh. Our species has lived in a state of dissociation from our true ecological selves, from the rest of life, the other beings that we share this planet with, this large interconnected system that we call the Earth. Now, I know how terrifying it can be to stare into the wound, to confront all that has already been lost, including time that has been lost. But I also know that transformation is possible. I know that every single person in this room is a part of it. Each of you has a truth to be lived, a story to be told, a stitch and a thread that is a part of the mending of this world. Earlier this year, we published an anthology of my writings over the years, 100 different lessons I had collected on what I now refer to as or know as spiritual ecology. The book is organized into 4 different themes, which I consider to be the 4 pillars of spiritual ecology, as well as the defining themes of my life: reverence, balance, evolution, and healing. It begins with reverence, which is an invitation to bridge science and spirituality, to once again fall in love with the wonders of our planet. I have found again and again in my life that love is a far more powerful motivator than fear. Because when you remind people that they are in love with the earth, or as Robin Wall Kimmerer says, that the earth loves us back, that changes us. Because when we love something, we are moved to protect it, rather than solely fear, which can cause us to isolate and shut down. And the second is balance, because when we begin to cultivate a sense of reverence for the world, we start to understand that we are part of a much larger balance. Our species is but one strand in the web of life. And in order to maintain that web, in order to maintain the health of the web and of this planet, we all have to adapt. And so the third theme is evolution. It is upon each of us to embody transformation on scales both individual and collective, small and large, to learn from the wisdom of nature, which is constantly reinventing itself, matter in metamorphosis, changing forms, slipping shapes again and again and again. And our species is not separate from that. And if we can do this, that is when the healing can begin. That is when we can return to ourselves, to each other, and to this beautiful planet that we call home. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Jim Coulter, Executive Chairman of TPG and Managing Partner of TPG Rise Climate, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Jason Kelly.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hello. So needless to say, you're getting a lot of different things here at the Green Festival. And so the pivot from Willow to Jim Coulter, you only see that at the Bloomberg Green Festival. We're going to talk about money, and we're going to talk about the fact that this is a fascinating moment to be an investor in this space. And just to tee you up a little bit, Jim, we've known each other for almost 20 years. We got to know each other when you were full on in the private equity, sort of classic private equity business. You made a sharp pivot about 5 years ago to go all in on this business, on investing in climate. 1,400 companies. You guys have presence in 50 countries, I believe. I want to have a wide-ranging conversation. I know you have some things to share with us, but I want to start by asking you, like, what's the biggest surprise? This was a massive bet in a lot of ways. Maybe the biggest bet you've made in your career. What have you learned?
I've learned that approaching climate change, you have to think of it as two sides of a coin. For years, since Keeling in the 60s, we've been focused on the need side. We have a problem to solve. But the other side of the coin is actually the opportunity. We're about to undertake a $120 trillion reindustrialization of the world, and that need and that opportunity need to move together. The money can't come from governments. No coalition of NGOs can get it done. Unless we can get the money moving in a capitalist system, we can't solve the problem. So this idea of putting the need and the opportunity together has been more challenging than I expected.
All right. So one of your signature moves as an investor over the past 40 years has been every year you get together with your investors and you put together this presentation. You and I have talked about it in the context of the year ahead. Now, as you're totally focused on climate, you have a version that you've been playing around with and presenting. We have a version that we're going to share with you, and we're going to run through it, if we can bring it up on the screen. All right. So I get to pick and choose here. All right, optimism, green shoots. Let's start there.
Just a little background on this. As well as creating an organization that invests, we actually have a very interesting seat in the middle of the climate ecosystem. We're meeting investors. Literally, I've met with 1,400 entrepreneurs around the world. We're operating $9 billion of climate companies. Those companies are forecasted to replace, against the counterfactual, about 160 million cars off the road for a year. So we're kind of in the mix. But not only are we generating investments, we're hopefully generating insights. So this is us stepping back from that process to watch.
So we're inside your brain right now. This is cool. Let's go.
So first of all, green shoots. And one of the things that I've been a tech investor, I've been a climate investor. Both of them are known for one thing, which is conferences. Like, there are more tech conferences, more climate conferences than I've ever seen, but they look and feel very different. Same hotels, same awful coffee, same bad Danish. But let me show you what a tech conference sounds like. Can we get...
But I'm genuinely optimistic about work in the metaverse. Whether as a hologram sitting next to you in a physical meeting or in a discussion taking place in the metaverse,
I think this technology is inevitable. I think this is the future of the internet. So I think over time you will see greater and greater acceptance.
We believe that AI will be about individual empowerment and agency at a scale that we've never seen before, and that will elevate humanity to a scale that we've never seen before either.
We'll be able to create a theory of the entire universe.
A Tesla car next year will probably be 90%.
That's 2014.
Autopilot.
I'm extremely confident of achieving full autonomy and releasing it to the Tesla customer base next year.
Everything is possible. Everything is happening tomorrow, like a font of optimism. Yeah. If you go to a climate conference, it's different, and for good reason. We can go ahead on this, Bruno. I want to show you a word cloud from a recent climate conference I went to. Supply chain problems, inflation, NIMBYism, et cetera. Essentially, there's almost a paradox of pessimism, and that's well earned. But every once in a while, I find myself saying, I want to just channel my inner tech for a second and like, what could go right? And let me share just a few things that are out there. First of all, I think we have to assume discontinuities. If you look at most of the climate work that's done, it's over 30 years, essentially assuming, and this is, by the way, I'm sorry, if you go back one, please. If you go back to what SBTI just put out for the path to net zero, I want to read this to you, Jason, for a moment. So this is what business is supposed to do. The minimum forward-looking ambition of near-term targets consistent with reaching net zero by 2050 at the latest, assuming a linear absolute reduction, linear intensity reduction, and intensity convergence between the most recent year and not increasing absolute emissions or intensity.
I mean, that makes total sense to me, right?
Now, first of all, there's great science behind that. I admire it. But imagine trying to figure out the iPhone in 1982 based on a computing graph. One thing I know from 40 years in business is nothing is linear, and there will be surprises. In fact, we should assume that there's going to be discontinuity. More people died from infections than heart attacks before penicillin. You know, taxis were taxis before Uber. Trading was trading until indexing. So industries constantly go through disruptions. As I travel the climate world, I'm running into disruptions that are about to happen at any time. I can't yet tell you which will happen, but I would bet on the field. There are going to be discontinuities that break our way. Our goal is to position for them. The second thing I'd point out on the green shoot side is understand the power of cost curves. Think about cell phones. In about 2000, they hit a whole new level, and suddenly they were ubiquitous. It changed how video conferencing came out in 1964, but it was $5,300 an hour. When it's free, things work very differently. In the climate world, you are watching some of the most powerful industrial cost curves I've ever seen. 28% for solar, that is double a normal industry. And these cost curves, while they look linear, they hit points, like right about now when solar becomes dramatically cheaper, things happen. We can predict the cost curves, we can't predict how the market change.
So then why that word cloud of pessimism?
Well, I think in some ways, the voices that got us to this key moment have been calling out the need. And part of the reason I'm on the stage, I don't do many conferences, is we need to change our voices a little. We need to also make sure that we're looking for that opportunity. And we're looking for Colin Powell once said about leadership is that optimism is a force multiplier. We have to find a little bit of optimism. That is not to deny that this is tough. And the last thing on optimism is, you know, when things like this conference happen where you get many parts of society, policy members, activists working together, things happen.
Yeah.
Anyone remember the population bomb? 30 printings back in 1968. We were going to be out of food. Los Angeles, the smog was awful. I was in Beijing 3 weeks ago. The skies were clear. The ozone layer is actually going the other way now. With time and with action, I think we can make progress. And that green shoots are something we need to grab a hold of.
All right, so I'm going to go counter then for my next for my next question, which is the whataboutisms.
Yeah, we also, as well as some optimism, we have to basically not fall for whataboutism.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the interesting things that's happened, if you look online and at social media, the attacks of climate deniers have flattened, but the attacks on climate solutions have gone up. And these are whataboutisms. Now, whataboutisms is a term that came from the 70s with the Irish Republican Army. Whenever they would do something, they'd say, what about the British soldiers? And Soviet propaganda uses whataboutisms. When Chernobyl hits, it's what about 3 Mile Island? And whataboutisms have hit now an absolute art form in today's politics. Let me just kind of show you what that sounds like.
What about those 21 Democrats?
What about beans that have more oil?
What about the Buddhists? What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? What about us?
What about me?
What about terrorism?
But what about Benghazi? What about the blatant lies that the Obama administration told us? What about the fact that Ben Rhodes bragged about lying to the media and the public about the Iran deal?
Whenever a pundit or a politician starts with what about, be prepared to be deflected and potentially deceived. So whatabouts are rampant in climate. Like, what about EVs?
Right.
Aren't they dirtier? Well, yes, when it leaves a factory, because you have the battery in it, it's slightly more emissions at manufacture. But once it gets on the road, an EV is 90% more efficient and uses 1/3 of the emissions over its lifetime. It's a ridiculous argument. Or what about solar panels in China? Yes, they take some of the power from a grid that is still dirty and they generate emissions. But if you look at the numbers, those emissions are replaced in 3 months of their 25-year life. Are we not supposed to use solar panels because we're trying to replace a grid that's dirty? We can never replace it if we don't start using them. It's a circular argument. Or one of my favorites is basically the pessimism and whataboutism with materials. Yes, we have a lot of work to do. We can find oil in the North Sea. We can't find lithium. Like, if you look at what happened in lithium, we went from worried we'd never have enough lithium to a massive oversupply in 2 years. So my point here is, as we're going down this path, we have to make sure that we don't get caught in the whataboutisms. And I always say, like, what about doing the work?
Yeah.
What about solving the problem?
And so how do you institutionalize, or how do you sort of create, I mean, because part of this is perception, part of this is the dialogue, part of this, we saw a lot of cable news clips, and between cable news and social media, it picks up a lot of steam. So what can a group like this of the what about we do the work folks do?
It's exactly that. I think one of the things I've learned in climate, and to your earlier question of why I've gone deep, is you cannot be a tourist in climate. You can't just sort of pop in and think you know the answer. This is an immensely complicated revolution that we're going through. I don't think I have to tell this room because you're here, but we have to encourage people to do the work and not simply fall back on how things are done now.
Right.
Just as an aside here, you have to understand what we're doing is a simplification problem. I want you to think about our current energy system. You want to turn on a light. How does that work? Well, first of all, 50 million years ago, the sun shines. It's captured in a tree. The tree falls down. For 50 million years, it gets subsumed under thousands of feet. We then take an iron pipe. We put it down 10,000 feet. We turn it right. We put in water. We crack rock. We bring up a vapor. The vapor goes in 3 million miles of pipe. We wash it in a $250 million natural gas processing plant. We put it in 3 million miles of pipe again. We put it to $1 billion gas turbine. We basically blow it up, releasing a molecule that can destroy the world, and we have an electron. The other way to do that is we can get sun from this afternoon, hit a silicon panel. There's silicon everywhere, and we have an electron.
Yeah.
So it seems hard to do. I mean, this is hard to do, but what we're doing is hard.
Yeah.
So, why not make it a little more simple?
All right. So that takes me to the third one that I wanted to touch on with you, which is the policy box, because this is a room of doers, as you mentioned. It's not totally simple how we get this done, and it requires a bunch of different angles. So tell us about the policy side.
Yeah, I think we have had an enormous gift, and we picked up an enormous set of allies in the recent policy wave. And I'm often asked, are you nervous investing in areas that have subsidies? I'm nervous investing in food. I mean, there's 400 million of subsidies in
Right.
European food. Healthcare, that's subsidized. And if you think about the IRA, it's about $76 billion a year. we are subsidizing fossil fuels around the world at close to $700 billion a year. So it's not just about subsidies, it's are they settled and has it become part of the landscape in a way we can count on? And, it's staggering what's happened in the last 4 years. If you look at it, the U.S. in three bills, it's close to $600 billion. If you go to Europe, they've pledged $1.6 trillion. You can never really tell in Europe where the dollars are there, but it's been pledged. China, the only part of investment that grew in China last year is green sector of their economy. And, it's not just there. It's India, which is all in, Australia. Australia has a Green New Deal, and I could go on and on around the world. Kenya, Malaysia. The world has decided, much like healthcare, much like education, that this is an area that needs to be subsidized. But what's important is actually not the numbers, and this has been a light going off for me. It's the shape. So the original policy dilemma was a balance beam, affordability and sustainability. And as I showed you, the affordability is getting better. But what happened is we've now changed the shape of policy. With the Ukraine, suddenly Europe and around the world realized that they could not count on the current system for energy security. If you want energy security and you don't have oil and gas, you got to go green.
Right.
So suddenly, green had a new ally, which was security. And then a fourth ally picked up, because if you look at the IRA, probably the key part of it, and the reason Macron was so mad at us, was there was a industrial policy to it, a reindustrialization of the country. 270,000 jobs in the U.S., millions of jobs in China. They figured out in China that for every job that they lose in the fossil fuel industry, they pick up 4.5 in the green. So suddenly, this debate that many of us in the room have been rooting for, the environmentalists, the activists, got new allies, and those new allies are called energy security and jobs.
Right.
And those allies are showing up in weird places. One of the reasons that I'm maybe less worried about policy right now changing with an administration is the money has gone to the red states. The blue states voted for it. The money has gone to the red states. And so your new set of allies looks like this.
In the heart of Texas, green jobs are booming.
But increasingly, Wyoming's energy comes not from mining what's down below, but from mining the wind above.
Different kind of farm in Crittenden County is planting the seeds to grow jobs and produce green energy.
Texas is seeing a boom in renewable energy, and that means more companies are hiring.
The governors of Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana announced the hydrogen partnership this week.
But
essentially now, politicians are in a box. If we did away with the IRA, we do away with a lot of jobs. And are the politicians that have been cutting ribbons willing to shut the factories down?
And do you think, we're headed for, I think it's fair to say, quite an election. Do you have confidence? Do you have real confidence that a new administration, a non-democratic administration, will continue to invest here?
As my partner Hank Paulson said, if some of the things happening in politics happen here, this is maybe number 10 on my list.
Yeah.
So I can't have confidence about a lot of things.
Right.
But what I can say is these allies of jobs make a difference.
And Texas is a fascinating example of that, because clearly not a lot redder than that place. All right, we just have a couple minutes left. Let's talk about passing the baton briefly, because I feel like that's a nice sort of way to send this audience off, or send us off, I guess, and give them something to chew on.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm watching, this is important, it's an important moment, is a bit of a passing the baton of a race that we're all running together. And I think it's a very positive thing. We should celebrate it. In certain types of human endeavor, there tends to be a little bit of a relay race. This is an Olympic year or something, thinking relays. And it often starts with the scientists. Think about Niels Bohr, the ARPANET scientists, Mariko and Wiseman. Then it moves on to the prophets. The people tell us we need to pay attention. Einstein sends a note to FDR, says you got to think about this bond thing. Gates talks about pandemics. It then moves to the policymakers. And finally, it moves kind of to the people who then have to get it done, the people in this room and elsewhere that have to get it done.
I do love that young, handsome Al Gore up there.
How about that, huh? He invented the internet.
Quite a callback.
He didn't invent the internet, but he helped empower it.
Yeah.
Right? And so this relay race happens over and over again. And if you think about what's been happening in climate, we owe so much to the scientists, Yoshino, Keeling, who's got us started, right? And then the people that have called out the need, right? We owe so much to this. The policymakers, as I just showed you, stepped up. You know, part of the reason I'm on this stage is the rest of us have to step up.
Yeah.
There's a passing of a baton that needs to happen to people. To answer your question, that's what we're trying to do.
And so, less than a minute, given everything that you've just told us, clearly you've thought about this a little bit. What does this room do? Like, what do you send them off with what's something that they can take home and say to their families, say to their partners, say to their kids about the next step that they need to take, given that you represent the money side of this?
Yeah, I think the money is going to start moving because the opportunity is there. But I think importantly, we need to take a bias to action and a touch of optimism. So one of the things that happens in a relay race is the last leg is sometimes the fastest. And what surprised people historically is when you look at the time, I mean, after 30 years of the atomic revolution, Oppenheimer stepped in and won a war, won 7 Oscars, right? So I think there's an optimism here that we can get this moving. We may not be moving fast enough, but we are moving faster. And the path to progress and perfection starts with progress.
Right.
And I see that, I think, that's happening, and the passing of the baton will accelerate it. So let's have some hope.
All right, and let's get to work. Jim Coulter, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Please welcome to the stage Sue Bird, WNBA legend and co-founder of Together and a Touch More, and Kara Hurst, Chief Sustainability Officer of Amazon, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Carol Masser.
Yes, this is a rock star panel. I'm just going to put it out there. How's everybody doing? All right. Well, I have to say, these two are pretty incredible, and they have unique connections. I just want to do a little quick setup. Kara spearheaded the Climate Pledge, which was co-founded by Amazon back in 2019. Group of more than 500 companies, I think it was 503 to be exact, per your website, 45 countries around the globe. They've made a commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2040. Amazon purchased the naming rights into what is today the Climate Pledge Arena. That was back in 2020. Sue is a member of the ownership group of the WNBA team, of course, the Seattle Storm. The Storm was the first WNBA team to actually sign the Climate Pledge, and the second North American professional sports team to do so. So pretty cool. The Storm plays home games, of course, in the Climate Pledge Arena. And Sue, by the way, won her 5th Olympic gold medal in Tokyo in 2020. So I'm just kind of tying it all together. Another connection that these two have is really phenomenal platforms. And that's where I kind of want to start, because when you have a platform, you kind of have a responsibility to use it. So, Kara, I want to start with you. For you guys at Amazon, it is largely about a lot of things, but for you, sustainability and the climate. How do you think about the value of having Amazon, worldwide known, huge firm, huge company, massive platform? How do you think about the responsibility of that platform, and how do you prioritize the things you want to do?
Sure. Well, I couldn't be more excited to be on this stage and this conversation today. So thanks for having me. It's a huge responsibility and also a really exciting one, because one of the things we get to do at Amazon is to use our scale and really the speed also that we go at to send really big demand signals for clean technologies, like what was just being discussed, to say that we want an accelerated fight towards climate change. And what you just mentioned, that we set our intention to be net zero carbon by 2040, that's 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement. And we set that looking at the science and saying, we think we're in this decisive decade. We know we need to move faster. We have a lot of optimism about doing that, but we can't go alone. And we're excited that over 500 organizations and other companies have joined us in that. But we want to send these really strong demand signals, and we want to also put our own resources towards that. So we've been doing things like purchasing renewable energy. We're the largest corporate purchaser of renewable energy in the world. We have been for the last 4 years. We announced yesterday we've actually hit 100% renewable energy across our global operations, which is a huge feat. We have over 500 projects.
Yes, exactly.
Around the world. We've got 24,000 electric delivery vehicles on the road already. We've got one of the world's largest electric charging infrastructure kind of operations going. We've just got, we look at all the different aspects of our operations and think about how do we make it more sustainable on behalf of our customer. We want to reduce waste. We took out those plastic air pillows. We took out 95% of those in North America. So we want to make a sustainable company and do it on behalf of our customer.
Sue, I want to bring you into it. You are part of a group of very elite athletes. And when we use the word legendary, it doesn't apply to everybody, but it definitely applies to you. So kudos. That platform, though, has been a couple of decades in the making and then some. How do you think about your platform and the responsibility of how you use it?
Yeah, women's sports is at an interesting moment, especially women's basketball. And for
a good interesting, right?
Yeah, no, great interesting. Great interesting. But what's interesting about it, maybe in a negative sense, is while the coverage has increased, what I've noticed is it's not always accurate. And it's really had me take a step back and be like, first of all, what else is inaccurate out there being told to us, by trusted places, other trusted platforms. So I think for me, when it comes to my platform, for so long while I was playing, it was about, bringing a certain understanding to the game, right? Using my platform for all kinds of good. Now I'm like, wait a minute. I got to make sure the stories that are being told are accurate. I got to make sure that when people are tuning into a game, they have a full understanding. So that's really where I feel like I can use my platform now as a retired player.
It's also the way women athletes have been portrayed. Like I was reading some things about the Olympics coming up and the Olympic Committee, how they've been changing some of the standards and updating in terms of how they want media representation of women. And it's not just how they look or kind of superficial stuff, but really just what they are achieving. That's important.
So important, so important. I think what's beautiful about women, especially women's athletes, is we are dynamic. We've had to be. For so long, we weren't getting the coverage that we deserve. We weren't getting the credibility. So we had to have different parts of us. So I think it is great to highlight those things. But to your point, not just about appearance, not just about these artificial things. So I love that the Olympic Committee is doing that.
I want to talk a little bit about the climate pledge. So I'm curious, Kara, when you have conversations with companies, what is it? Is it tough to get them to sign on? Or tell us kind of the environment here.
Yeah, I think it's a huge commitment to sign on, and it certainly takes resources. And so I think it takes a leap of faith, too. Not all of us know how we're going to get there. There are some things we know how to do, like electrifying fleet, and then there are other things like aviation, where we know sustainable aviation fuel is part of it, but we don't know all of the solves. And so some of it is a bit of jumping into the fray and saying, we know some of how we're going to get there, and also we need to partner to figure out some of the other ways which we don't necessarily know. And we need to change the game, right? So we need to figure out how we're going to come together and make new decisions together, put resources together, and also public-private partnerships are a big part of it. So how do we come together and work in the cities where we all have employees or we have operations and get cities to change their infrastructure, and build differently the buildings that we're in, or put more rail in, or change our, the ways in which people commute, and those kind of things as well.
Well, Sue, was it like a no-brainer for the Storm to sign the climate pledge?
I was playing then, so I wasn't in those rooms. But
that's true.
Yes, but knowing our franchise, knowing the ownership group, I'm sure I'm sure it was a no-brainer. They're very much an ownership group that wants to help the world change. I mean, it's a big statement, but at the same time, when you find the ways that you can have that impact, it's really not that big of a statement. You can really change the world.
I always think about, like, you know, we all set out on a course, whether we go to school or we start working and we think we're going to go this way and then we start going a different way. And I'm curious about, Sue, like, what motivates you and how maybe that has evolved over the years to where you are today?
Yeah, well, I'm very lucky, I say this from the start, to be an athlete. When you think back to childhood, when I think back to my childhood, I was just a kid that really liked playing. Like, I just loved playing sports, and how lucky am I that that led to an actual career where I graduate college and immediately I have a job, a profession waiting for me. So I was super lucky in that sense. But throughout my career, motivations change, right? Yeah. There's the motivation early of maybe wanting to prove yourself in a field, right? You haven't, in my world, I haven't won the championship yet. I haven't won awards yet. So I have this grit about me that I want to prove it. But then that flips when you have done it, and now you have to prove that it wasn't a fluke. And now you have to sustain, and now you have to stay, for lack of a better, on top of that mountain, which has a whole other type of challenge. And for me, as I kept doing that, then it became, okay, I've won the things. Now how can I actually have an impact on this? So it's really interesting how through the course of my career, I've had these different moments, these different types of mountains, and trying to figure out how to stay motivated. And again, I'm lucky, I play a team sport. A lot of my motivation came within the locker room, within my team. I had teammates to look to, whether they were pushing me or I was pushing them seeing me succeed, me seeing them succeed. And that's really a big motivating factor for me.
What about for you, Kara, in terms of your job? And I think about your career, too. You've been in Silicon Valley, different worlds in terms of sustainability. How do you think about, like, what motivates you in terms of your choices and then wanting to be part of Amazon and their mission?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I've worked in NGOs, I've worked in government, I've worked in now corporate America. And I think, you know, being on those teams and thinking about the different languages you have to be able to speak, I'm impact oriented. So what I really have been motivated by is trying to figure out a way. I've always wanted to make a difference, wanted to make an impact on the world. I've worked on human rights issues, I've worked on environmental issues, and I want to figure out what is, like, how do I use the resources and the scale of whatever I'm working on to kind of make that change. And in NGOs, you have influence in a different way. Government, you have scale, you have policy changes you can make. In corporate America, you have resources, and you have a different kind of scale. And you have to kind of speak the language of the different team that you're on and the different kind of context you're in, but you have to remain authentic to yourself and you know, lead in the way that's going to make the folks around you understand the impact that you're trying to make and the context that you're in.
How do you guys think about the next generation in particular? And Sue, let me go over to you. You know, I think about the next, you really kind of changed the game, no pun intended, in terms of the attention that you've brought to certainly women's sports, women's basketball, on the college level, and then, of course, on the professional level. Like, you made a difference. Like, it's huge. And I think young women need to see that. So how do you think about that?
I mean, I've always taken great pride in that. I think what's amazing about this younger generation, and I can kind of tell the story within a story, if you will. When I got towards the end of my career and we were doing things like CBA negotiations, it was really the younger players. So if I'm, by the way, at this point I was like 37 and I was considered old. I'm still like
that's so
figuring
unfair.
that out. I'm like, wait a minute, am I old? Am I young? But we had, you know, the younger players at that point in the WNBA were 21 to, let's say, 25, right? Like this age range. And for me, I had grown up in a era where we were fighting, but also just happy to have a league in a sense.
Yeah.
You know, and I hesitate to use this term, but we're all very familiar with the shut up and dribble, cringe. But that's really how it was a little bit. We were happy to have a league. We didn't want to push too hard because, oh, we don't want this taken away from us. And now, like I said, I'm in my late 30s, these players in their early 20s, so this younger generation you're alluding to, they were like, no. Like, we need charters. We need charter flights. What are we talking about? Like, no, this locker room, not good enough. And they really, it wasn't an entitlement as much as it was, this is what we deserve.
Right.
This is what's right. And I think the combination of the two generations, if you will, in our last CBA negotiation is really what got us to a really promising place, and it really set us up for the future.
Kara, for you, and I know we've talked about sustainability is something that a younger generation looks about. I have a 21-year-old daughter, and she's turning the things over, looking at ingredients. Where was this made? What's the carbon footprint?
Sure.
Like, they matter, and they care.
They do.
So how do you think about what you guys need to do at Amazon in terms of the next generation?
Yeah, I think increasingly this next generation, they both care a lot, they're incredibly passionate, and they have a lot of anxiety about what's coming and what the state of the world is. And so one of the things I think is our responsibility is, one, to act fast, to drive big solutions, but also to bring some optimism to it. We have time. We don't have a lot of time. We're in this decisive decade where we have to act now.
Right.
We have to move very quickly. And so I think one of the things that we need to lead on is to show that there are solutions, but we need to deploy them now. We cannot wait any longer. So one of the things leaders need to do is to take those decisive actions. We need to make changes now, and we need to make them at scale.
So I want to ask you, can you stand up for a second and show your T-shirt?
Stand up?
Yeah.
All right.
Look at this T-shirt. This is
your T-shirt.
Yes. Sue's T-shirt. I'm doing this because, Kara, I want you to ask a question of Sue. I mean, these are incredible leaders. Like, I can throw you in a bar and I can imagine the conversation. What do you want to ask Sue?
We've already had some really great conversations about lots of things, New York and favorite shows and stuff like this. But one of the things is I was thinking about is you have so many different passions and interests, and we were talking about some of the things you could work on, and I'm sure you get approached all the time with ideas that people have for you, given your platform and your reach and how passionate you are about things. So how do you go about making decisions about what you want to spend your time on and how you use your platform and how with all the things you could inspire the next generation to do? How do you make decisions about where you want to spend your time?
Yeah, great question. Still working on it. I'm only retired, soon to be close to 2 years. Which still feels really fresh. And the best part about being an athlete was that was it. That was the North Star. That was the priority. And what you could fit in around that, you would try, but that was always the guiding light. And that got, I don't have that anymore. So in a wonderful way, I shouldn't complain. I have a ton of options. But like anybody who has that problem, there's a bandwidth situation. You got to worry about your own mental health in that way. So it's been tricky. But I think what I learned when I started working with brands as an athlete was you want to be aligned with your values. So I think that's really become like the guiding light. You want the values to be aligned with no matter who you're working with, whether it's a brand, a company, the people you're going to go into partnership in business. You want to make sure that aligns. And I found that when that's there, when that's the baseline and the foundation, then you can start to maybe carve out things you're passionate about. Then you can start to carve out things maybe that you think are going to have a larger impact. But as long as that foundation is there, then you can make your decisions based on all the other things you might be interested in. And then, of course, the bandwidth part is really, that's what I think I took on a little bit too much, to be honest, and now I'm whittling back.
Sometimes you have to say no.
Yeah. Saying no, the power of no.
Yeah.
Turning the table. Sue, a question for Kara?
Yeah. So something that I know that I've encountered, being a woman, is at times I've walked into rooms and I've just kind of assumed that maybe I wasn't the smartest or I didn't have enough experience, enough knowledge. And I can only imagine in the corporate world what that must be like as a woman walking into these different rooms. And I'm wondering if there is either advice you want to share for up-and-coming women in this way, or maybe a moment where you were like, oh no, like what I have to bring to this room is just, if not more important than everybody else.
Yeah, I'm a little bit older than you. So I think it's taken a while. But one of the things I think is really important in order to be able to lead is to really just figure out who you are first and really own that. And I think over the years, just really understanding what you have to offer and the authenticity of your own experiences and just feeling that and owning it. And I think once you really live that in your own body, actually, knowing and owning that experience, all that value that you've had, all that leadership that you have on the court, how valuable that is in any context. And it doesn't matter you haven't had business experience or you haven't had experience in XY situation. The leadership that you've been able to bring, in an Olympic setting, 0.00001% of the world's population has been able to, lead under that kind of a pressure. And so I think whatever that translates for any of you, to take a moment back, take a breath and be like, I got this. I can lead in that kind of a situation, and then just feel that, take a breath, and own it. I think that we all need to just kind of remember sometimes who we are.
All right, just got 50 seconds, so this can be really quick. We started talking about platforms and using your platforms. Sue, advice to everybody out there. Everybody has a platform. Yeah. What's your advice? What do you hope people walk away from?
Yeah, I think at times the word platform can be almost intimidating because you think you have to have. I said it kind of early. I touched on it earlier.
Yeah.
Like, to say you want to change the world is such a big statement. It can be intimidating. Like, do I have a platform? How big is my platform? How am I ever going to do that? But the reality is, if it's just one person, that's going to ignite change. So I feel like at times you have to really zoom out from that intimidation factor and realize whether it's in your own home, your family, your community, whatever ways in which you can impact, even if it's just one person, it's huge. Sorry.
One person makes a difference. I love it. All right, Kara, real quick.
I would just say, remain optimistic, because I think, the beauty in being optimistic can have a lot of power.
Going to leave it there. I wish we had oodles of more time. Sue, Kara, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Please welcome to the stage Ali Santori, Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer of Providence, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Lauren Keel.
Ali, Providence is Washington State's largest healthcare provider. So why, as a hospital and healthcare system, are you all concerned about climate change?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Lauren. As one of the largest non-for-profit healthcare systems in the United States, we are both on the front lines of treating the climate crisis. So we see that truly our climate crisis is a public health crisis. So we are seeing increased respiratory illness, increased heat-related illness. At the same time, healthcare is a major contributor to the climate crisis. So few people know that the U.S. healthcare system emits about 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. So if the gas emissions of the healthcare system were a country, it would be all of Great Britain. So I like to think about it in the names of our unofficial poet laureate in the United States, Taylor Swift. Hi, I'm the problem, it's me, when it comes to healthcare.
You mentioned how climate change is disproportionately impacting vulnerable populations. How are you seeing that affect the healthcare space, and what are you trying to do about it?
Unfortunately, systemic inequities are everywhere. When it comes to our climate crisis, those who contribute the least to climate change are impacted the most. So, for example, in 2021, we had an extreme heat dome in the Pacific Northwest where we had several consecutive days over 100 degrees. And our infrastructure is not equipped to handle that. So we had issues with continuing our operations within the hospitals. But tragically, there were about 1,400 people who died due to heat-related illnesses, and those were preventable deaths. And those who suffered the most were those who didn't have resources or access to cooling centers, air conditioning. So truly, the most poor and vulnerable are disproportionately impacted. For us at Providence, one of our core values is justice. So we see this as a justice issue and as part of our efforts to advance health equity.
And is there guys, clap for that, please. How can you help those populations? Is there information that you have? Is there access? What can you as a healthcare system do?
Well, we're working on addressing our own problem and our responsibility. So at Providence, since we established our goal to work to become carbon negative by 2030, we now have 89 sites operating on 100% renewable energy. We are also addressing the extreme amount of waste that hospital systems create. It takes a lot of energy to run hospital systems, but waste is kind of a sleeper issue. So just across the Providence system, we generate 100 million pounds of waste a year. And before we started on this journey, much of that waste goes to landfills. Where are landfills located? Disproportionately in low income and community of color. So we are working on our waste optimization. Several of our sites, we've been able to reduce waste by 50%. So we're going to continue that journey. But we also can't do it alone. We need to reach into our communities and partner with them one of the things that we've done is we have a program that outlines vulnerabilities of individuals when it comes to heat-related extreme weather events, who is most susceptible. We are able to identify those individuals in the electronic medical record, and when there is an extreme weather event, we can go into the community, contact those individuals, reach out to them, provide them with the resources that they're not able to secure themselves, so air conditioning, air filtration systems, take them to a cooling center. So we are working both within the walls of our hospitals and then outside of the walls to partner with the community to help those who are disproportionately impacted.
You mentioned the heat dome. We've had hot temperatures this week. We've seen hurricanes. How are you thinking about the increased impact of natural disasters? How do you make sure that your providers are prepared for that, your facilities are going to be able to withstand it when people are going to need your help the most?
Climate resiliency for the healthcare system is a major issue. We were very proud at Providence to be the first healthcare organization to sign on to the HHS and White House Climate Pledge. Part of that pledge was the creation of a resiliency plan. So we just completed our resiliency plan for 51 hospitals to ensure that we can continue to serve our communities and also continue that outreach into the communities in the face of these extreme weather events.
And what makes you most excited about the change and the ability that you can affect in the climate space?
I think what makes me most excited is partnerships, like with all of the leaders in this room, the work and the awareness that Bloomberg is bringing to this issue. And I think while this is a challenge for healthcare, it's also our biggest opportunity. We have an opportunity to advance climate justice, advance health equity, and eliminate health disparities. So for me, that's what gets me up every day, and I couldn't be more proud that Providence is leading the way in this.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Allie.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Please welcome to the stage Bruce Harrell, Mayor of the City of Seattle, for a conversation with Bloomberg Philanthropies' Antha Williams.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm Antha Williams. I lead the climate and environment programs at Bloomberg Philanthropies, which includes work on oceans and air pollution, energy transition, sustainable finance, and cities, which is what we're here to talk about today. And Seattle has been a really close partner of Bloomberg on many topics that are close to our heart, from clean energy to green jobs and buildings. And I think at Bloomberg, where our mission is to ensure the best, greatest, longest lives for the greatest number of people, the intersection of cutting emissions with providing livelihoods and good-paying jobs to people is really central, and that's something that Seattle has demonstrated a lot of leadership in. So we're excited about the conversation here today. Mayor Harrell has demonstrated a deep commitment to good green jobs and making them available to all. Through the Seattle Green New Deal and the workforce development programs, the city is really investing in clean energy jobs training in growing industries like construction and energy efficiency and clean energy. So I want to start with a few questions for you, Mayor, and hear what's happening here in Seattle, and thank you for hosting us for this event. In December, the city unanimously passed a buildings performance standard. So it would be great just to hear a little bit about the impact of that work and why it's so important.
Thank you, Antha. Excuse me. Thank you for having me here. And before I'm a politician, so I'm not going to answer your question directly right away. You know that. I want to thank all of you for having the festival here. I mean, we are honored as a city, not just as a city, but as a state. I think we have one of the greenest governors, and Jay Inslee, in the country. And Bloomberg, thank you. I get $20 every time I say that, by the way, so it's adding up. But in all seriousness, we are very prideful of our commitment to what I call the climate war, if you will. So thank you for having the festival here. Getting back to we call it BEPS, the Building Emissions Performance Standard. Now, you have to recognize something, that we put a stake in the ground by saying that we're going to reduce our carbon emissions by 2030, 27% by our major buildings. Now, what's important about that is this is a time coming out of COVID when a lot of our downtowns throughout your respective cities are hurting for occupancy. We recognize that. There's no perfect time to fight against climate change. And so working with the building owners, working with our residents and our workers and our employees, trying to get people back into our cities, we said now is the best time to reflect our values. It's during tough times you reflect your values. And so it's the functional equivalent of getting 72,000 fossil-fueled gasoline cars off the road. So we looked at, what our buildings are doing. We put a stake in the ground, and there's sort of 4 pillars of what we're trying to create. Number one is energy production, of course, and that employs a lot of people. Your designs, your architects, everyone that could help us design it. You look at the construction piece, and you see at our climate work, we bring out construction and building and trades and our unions and our labor workforces to fight for us with us, because it's really, really cool, as all of you know, to create jobs and save our planet, save the land, save the air, save the water. And so we make sure that we have our advocates there standing with us as we push this kind of legislation through. And of course, on the compliance side, to measure what we're doing, that employs a lot of people as well. And so you could put a stake in the ground, but it's meaningless if you don't measure it. And so we look at, again, in my role as mayor, quite candidly, is I have to be sort of unashamedly bullish about our climate commitment. It's hard to convince people that are hungry or dealing with opioid addiction and mental illness and miseducation and other types of challenges in their life to say, but we have to save the planet. This work that all of you are doing, by the way, we're not going to have this work done in our lifetime. So we're fighting for something beyond our meager and short-lived existence on Earth. That's a noble thing. And so as mayor, my job is not only to put the stake in the ground, to motivate people to think beyond themselves. And so our BEPS was a good building emissions performance. I'll call it BEPS. Our BEPS platform was not just a means to say, let's reduce carbon emissions by 27% in these huge buildings, but to say this is a unifying element, regardless of race, socioeconomic level, gender, whatever demographic you decide you want to identify with. This is a unifying element to fight for something beyond ourselves. And that was the basis for our legislation.
One of the other programs that you've taken on is low pollution neighborhoods, which I love the sound of that. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so here in Seattle, and first of all, Seattle's pretty cool, right? All right. I was amazed, by the way, just in preparation for this, talking to folks, that some of the technology you all are working on. I met a young lady. She's probably going to love it when I give her a shout out. I can't remember your name, but she talked about getting people of color and women in industries that are traditionally dominated by a different demographic. And it's just amazing who I'm talking to right now. So we have to be honest here in Seattle. Seattle's about 84 square miles. And historically, you would not know this, but we had our issues of racism and segregation and racial restrictive covenants in certain neighborhoods in our 84 square miles, and many neighborhoods have been historically neglected. And so in looking at what neighborhoods need it the most, we decided to let's identify 3 as sort of a pilot, if you will, and let's create, in the name of equity and fairness and kindness, let's create low pollution neighborhoods and make sure we're doubling down. So yes, I think I get my days mixed up here. A couple of days ago, I announced that we're putting on a transportation levy. It's going to be $1.55 billion that is laden with climate work and transportation work and tree planting and canopy development and everything you want in a beautiful planet. More protected bike lanes, as an example. I had a bike advocate lobby me on that. And I said, oh, you're going to be very pleased with this package. So we're creating these neighborhoods and making sure that all of our investments sort of challenge what could be our model neighborhoods. I issued in 2022 a Transportation Climate Justice Executive Order, and in that we will demonstrate in these certain neighborhoods through objective criteria where we're going to focus, looking at more tree canopy, more protected bike lanes, looking at where we have just areas that get incredibly hot, how we could look at some of our own assets like community centers and turn them into resiliency hubs. And so it's a very focused approach, neighborhood by neighborhood, on creating our carbon neutrality.
That's great. Well, the issue of workforce development and green jobs, I know, has also been close to your heart and a big issue for many cities that we work in. I know the city just allocated another $2 million for inclusive workforce development in the clean energy sector to bring, in particular, more women and people of color into the workforce. And that feels like such an important issue to make sure that the skills gap is not slowing our transition to the clean energy economy. How is that program working? How do you see that happening here?
Yeah. Antha, thanks for that question. And so we're putting real money behind this. For example, we're putting $4 million in the local organizations to recruit. Now, if you remember one thing about this mayor of Seattle, I want you to remember this, that here in Seattle, many of you know I'm biracial. My mother was Japanese and my father was black, which means I look Hawaiian, by the way. And they met when they were 14, and they went to the same high school and married their entire life. And they taught me to look at race, I think, a little differently, because when I say who identifies as being multiracial, usually a few hands will go up. It's an increasing demographic, by the way, in this country, which is a good thing. But I say everyone's hand should go up. You look at your genealogy, and I guarantee you, you're not just one, didn't come from one country, if you want to look at countries. But in this work, I challenge you. We sit in conferences like this and we say, yeah, we're really cool. Let's hire more women. Let's hire more people of color. That's the right thing to do. But do we do it? Do you sit around in your groups and do you say, you know what, we need to be intentional about hiring a black person? Have any of you said that? Oh, sister in there said yes. I'm having fun with it because that's the kind of intentionality here in Seattle we are trying to create. Now, I don't assume anyone was good or bad or smart or dumb because of race. That is idiotic to make those assumptions. But the level of intentionality has to come from every individual, not just cool talks at seminars. And here in Seattle, I'm so proud that we are doing a lot of these kinds of things here. And quite frankly, mayors get stuff done. That's why the Bloomberg philanthropies and the different programs that they do, they understand that. And so in this work we're doing, we are investing. And I will lead the way. And like I said, I sort of double dip. I belong to the African American Mayors Association, the Asian American Mayors Association. I'll be the Eskimo if I have to be an Eskimo Association, because this country continues to be obsessed with race. And we're talking past each other, and climate work could be the biggest unifying element in this country, in this world, if we do this right. And so and some of you are doing some cutting edge work, saving this planet. And so I want to impress upon you that it starts with the conversations you have when no one's around. So we're putting $4 million into working with local groups. We invest another $2.24 million into the Clean Energy and Career Pathways program. Looking at we're going to employ close to 300 workers. There will be women and people of color. And this is not sympathy work. Oh, you've been excluded. This is the right thing to do because you get different ideas, you get a different lens. You're talking to the communities impacted the most by climate change, and they are at the table in a meaningful way. And you all here, if you are here in Seattle for this festival, you get this stuff. And so that's why I started by saying I'm honored that you are here, because you get to hear me say this as a biracial mayor. I'm the second person of color in 150 years in this city. I'm not going to squander the opportunity to say that here in Seattle and your respective cities doing this climate work, you can lead the way and overpower some of this racism that we talk about in this country, because you are doing the right thing, fighting for something that's bigger than yourself. And that is the essence of fighting against racism, is fighting for something bigger than yourself, and that's why you're here. And if you make money on the way, right on. No problem with it.
I love the focus on the data, the 300 jobs that it'll create, and the accountability that you put behind it. Mike Bloomberg often to us says, in God we trust, everybody else bring data. So you've no doubt heard that in your work with the Bloomberg Mayors Network. But You've been very active in the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, and one of the things, that's the global network of 100 mega cities that are taking bold, ambitious action on climate. And one of the things that's interesting and great about that network is there's participation standards. So if you're just saying good things but not actually doing them, you get kicked out. And one of the things that the mayors there often say is, we basically want to steal the best ideas from each other. So I wondered if you had anything to share about what you think would be some of the best stuff that other mayors ought to steal that you've proven is working here in Seattle, or if you have other ideas about things you're seeing other places that you're thinking, maybe I could steal that and make it happen in Seattle.
Yeah, thanks, Antha. I can't say anything without thanking Bloomberg Philanthropies again and C40 for recognizing some of the work that we did. We went to Buenos Aires and received an award, and quite honestly, these are life-changing experiences. As a mayor, when I talk to other mayors and sort of have these partnerships, I go right to the why, because when you're looking at whether it's water or air or energy production, I think most of you may know that we draw most of our power here. City Light is a couple of $2 billion utility that's under my jurisdiction here. We have about 14,000 employees. We have about an $8 billion budget. We have a strong mayor system, and when I talk to different mayors, I try to find out how they're generating their power, number one. And when we have to get our license to do this kind of work, we then have to look at the climate needs. The salmon recovery when we are damming facilities. What we thought was just good, clean hydropower, we realized it had an adverse effect on salmon recovery. So this is the balance I'm working at. So I talked to other mayors about that. I go back to the why are you doing this work again. For me, saving, and I use the word law, just not because I'm a lawyer, but it's always land, air, and water. I always think of what I'm trying to save. And that's my acronym. And I asked the other mayors, well, why are you doing this? I mean, I'm just trying to save the planet. For me, if we save the planet and we're all dead, what good does that do, right? So we're trying to save our people and the planet. And I try to, again, when I look at this audience, and I saw a very diverse audience here, and then I look at the sponsors here, I want to give kudos to the sponsors. I shouldn't call anyone by name. I'm looking at the signs. But they are looking at their industry. Let's say it's in the hospital industry, it's in the e-commerce industry, whatever it is. They're looking at their industry and they're trying to decide how they're going to partner with us on climate change. That is a beautiful thing. So in my conversations with other mayors, I have a good hand here. Some of these companies that step up here in Seattle, I mean, we're home to a lot of companies. I ask them, who are your biggest cheerleaders? Who are your biggest warriors? And we need real money, particularly in some of these startup companies, real money, real investment to get this done. And it's good to know that some of these mayors are thinking just like I am, and we steal ideas. And I'll say, look, the one thing the mayor has is the power to convene. When I was president of the city council, I'd make a few calls, and I'd get calls returned maybe half the time. When I call as mayor, they call right back. I take advantage of that sometimes too, by the way. And the mayor's ability to convene is strong. And quite candidly, some mayors don't realize that. And it's shocking to me when they don't realize their ability to convene to get things done. And that's what I'm learning through, I think, the most effective mayors.
That's really interesting. We did hear that, including in Buenos Aires, where you were recognized for Seattle's leadership among this C40 network, but just Seattle's incredible work to bring together the business community with community-based organizations, not to look at these issues as just coming out of City Hall. Mm-hmm. Mayor, I want to ask if there's anything else that you want to share. We're in an urgent time for all this work, but before we wrap, just any words for the crowd or things I haven't asked that we should make sure to cover?
Yeah, thanks for that wide open question, Antha. I would close by something I said a little earlier. And I get a little hokey, a little melodramatic when I start really thinking about the work that you all are doing. The work that I'd done as attorney wasn't necessarily in the world of climate change, and I have a younger group of leaders around me that get climate change better than I'm 65 years old. I know I look like I'm 40. They put makeup on me before, so maybe it worked. But I grew up in a generation where we knew just not to pollute, that we saw a television commercial and there's a Native American that was crying when someone littered, and it made us realize, well, you shouldn't litter. but we didn't grow up studying climate change, looking at the data, looking at the glacier meltdowns. We didn't think about that. In fact, the first thing you wanted was a big old car, and if it had 8 cylinders, it was a cool car, right? And that was my culture. What I concern myself now is the younger generation. There's opioids, there's fentanyl, they're dealing with, there's social media, there's bullying, there's a whole different generation of folks out there. And what I worry about is how do we create that climate generation, if we will, in our school system when they're 9, 10, 11 years old. They are going to be the ones that are going to change this planet with you. They're going to be your future employees. And so let's think about collectively how do we start partnering with our educational institutions. Not when they're in college. Their values are already pretty much set when they're in college. Either they're going to try to save the world or they're going to make a lot of money. Or they're an artist, which is cool, or they're using one side of their brain, but they're pretty much figuring out their stuff. But when they're in high school and middle school, their values start to shape, I think. And so in this work that we're doing is when you start working with your educational communities, remember that schools are underfunded. I've recently been to Korea and Japan, and I look at some of the world competition that our kids are up against. That's going to be the ones that really saves this work. So I just ask you in your busy schedules, can you mentor more kids? And that's another effort we're doing here. We're looking at all of our assets, our community centers, our tennis courts, our golf courts. We have a lot of assets here. And how do I turn those into mentoring centers such that we pass on all this good work that you're doing to the next generation? So let's think about that a little bit in our discussions.
That's great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mayor Bruce Harrell, thank you for your leadership. And thanks for hosting. Really appreciate it.
All right, you might want to just stay put for 1 second because I have a bunch of instructions for you before you go, so you know where to go and where everything is. It is time for lunch, as you can tell. So if you are an all-access pass holder, you can hit the Regenerate Cafe for lunch. For everybody else, we have a bunch of food trucks. If you just go right outside this way, you can hit all of our food trucks. We have a bunch of amazing selections, so you can check those out for the food.
And you can also check out, if you don't want to go for lunch right now or want to take your lunch with you, you can go to the Ideas stage in Nessam Hall. That runs from noon until 2, and we will also be live streaming the content from that stage here. Sessions there will include talks about moonshot factories, satellites, AI, climate and gender, and decarbonizing air flight.
And lastly, if you are registered for the breakout Better Together, Unlocking the Power of Climate Partnerships, that starts at 12:30 in the Cascade Room. I will be there, so I will see you there. So please go ahead and grab some food, hang out at the outdoor stage, which is also kicking off shortly. We have programming out there starting at 1, which will include Patagonia. We have the Songcatchers out there, the Climate Comedy Cohort, Tank and the Bangas, and much more. So please join that.
And don't forget, as attendees today, you get a complimentary 3-month corporate subscription to Bloomberg News for your team. So to scan the QR code on the screen above me to take advantage of that. And we'll see you back here at 2 o'clock.
See you at 2. Thanks.
Thank you.